Go ahead and look miserable, Victoria. At least make the party entertaining. Jason Whitmore said it with a smile, and somehow that made it worse. The guests around him laughed politely, the kind of laughter people offered when a wealthy man expected it. Victoria Bennett lowered her eyes and rested one hand on her 8-month pregnant belly. For a moment, she wondered if anyone in the room could see the difference between luxury and happiness. The crystal chandeliers sparkled above them. Champagne flowed without limits. A string quartet played near the marble staircase. From the outside, it looked like the kind of life people dreamed about. From the inside, it felt like standing alone in a crowded room while everyone applauded the wrong person. Then her phone vibrated. Victoria glanced down. One message. 3 words. 6 minutes left. Her breath caught. No name. No explanation. No number she recognized. Just a countdown. 6 minutes left. The message should have frightened her. Instead, it made her heart beat faster for a completely different reason. Across the ballroom, Jason was surrounded by investors, executives, and local celebrities celebrating the biggest business deal of his career. His laughter carried across the room. Confident, effortless, victorious. The kind of laughter that came from someone who believed nothing could go wrong. Victoria slipped her phone into her purse. She told herself not to react. Not yet. Not in front of everyone. Are you all right? An older woman beside her asked quietly. Victoria forced a smile. Just tired. It was not entirely a lie. She was tired. Tired of pretending. Tired of defending Jason whenever friends asked difficult questions. Tired of telling herself things would improve after the next promotion, the next acquisition, the next celebration. Most of all, she was tired of feeling invisible in her own marriage. 3 years earlier, Jason could not stop talking about her. Tonight, he had barely looked at her. Another wave of laughter erupted near the center of the ballroom. Victoria looked up. Jason was telling a story now. Guests leaned closer. Every word seemed designed to make him appear larger than life. He loved moments like this. The spotlight. The admiration. The certainty that everyone in the room wanted his approval. Her phone vibrated again. 5 minutes left. Victoria stared at the screen. The same message. No explanation. Just a countdown moving steadily forward. She looked around the ballroom. Nobody seemed to notice anything unusual. Waiters carried silver trays between tables. Investors exchanged business cards. A photographer moved through the crowd capturing smiles and handshakes. Yet something felt different. Subtle. Almost impossible to explain. Near the front entrance, 2 unfamiliar security guards stood quietly beside the doors. She had never seen them before. One checked his watch. The other glanced outside. A strange feeling settled in her chest. Not fear. Anticipation. Across the room, Jason finally noticed her looking in his direction. He raised his champagne glass with a smug grin. The guests around him laughed again. Victoria did not laugh. She simply watched him. For minutes. Whatever was coming was already in motion. She could feel it. Somewhere beyond the walls of the mansion, beyond the music and the expensive smiles, a chain of events had already begun. Years later, people would remember that night as the party that changed everything. But at that moment, standing beneath the chandeliers with a mysterious countdown ticking toward 0, Victoria Bennett knew only one thing. For the first time in a very long time, she was no longer waiting for Jason Whitmore to decide her future. 5 minutes left. The words lingered in Victoria Bennett's mind long after the screen went dark. She slipped her phone back into her purse and lifted her eyes toward the center of the ballroom. Jason Whitmore had become the gravitational force of the evening. Everywhere he moved, conversations followed. Investors laughed at his jokes before he finished telling them. Local reporters waited for quotes. Business partners competed for a few seconds of his attention. The celebration had been designed around him, and he looked completely at home beneath the crystal chandeliers and golden lights. Victoria remembered when success had made Jason grateful. Now it seemed to make him louder. Another round of applause erupted near the stage. Jason had climbed onto a small platform to address the guests. A giant screen behind him displayed photographs from his company's rise. Smiling executives, ribbon cuttings, magazine covers, headlines praising his business instincts. Looking at the images, a stranger would have assumed Jason had built everything alone. Victoria felt a familiar ache in her chest. Not because she wanted credit, because she remembered the truth. She remembered the late nights when payroll barely cleared. The weekends spent reviewing contracts at the kitchen table. The investors she quietly introduced him to years before anyone considered him successful. She never wanted recognition. She only wanted partnership. Somewhere along the way, those became two very different things. Jason lifted a champagne glass and smiled at the crowd. Tonight is proof that hard work always wins. The room erupted with approval. Victoria looked down. Her phone vibrated again. For minutes left. Her pulse quickened. Across the ballroom, one of the unfamiliar security guards stepped outside through a side entrance. Another checked his watch. Guests remained focused on Jason, but Victoria noticed small details most people missed. A valet near the front drive suddenly adjusted his posture. Two catering staff members exchanged confused glances while looking toward the estate entrance. Something was changing beyond the walls of the ballroom. Jason continued speaking. People always ask me the secret of success. He paused dramatically. Laughter followed. The answer is simple. Confidence. More laughter. More applause. Victoria watched him carefully. He seemed completely unaware of the invisible clock ticking around him. 3 months earlier, she would have felt embarrassed for him. Tonight, she felt something else. Curiosity. Her phone remained silent for several seconds. Then it vibrated again. 3 minutes left. Victoria slowly exhaled. Nearby, an older investor named Richard Palmer narrowed his eyes toward the ballroom entrance. He looked distracted, concerned, even. That caught her attention. Richard Palmer had spent 40 years navigating billion-dollar deals. Very little surprised him. Yet now he seemed unable to focus on Jason's speech. Another investor followed his gaze. Then another. Small reactions. Easy to miss. Impossible to ignore once noticed. Jason raised his voice. And none of this would have happened without people believing in me. The statement lingered in the air. Victoria looked away. A strange expression crossed her face. Not anger. Not sadness. Acceptance. Because the truth was that she had believed in him longer than anyone else in that room. Longer than the investors. Longer than the executives. Longer than Jason believed in himself. The realization no longer hurt. It simply felt finished. Near the ballroom entrance, a staff member hurried across the floor carrying a radio. His expression looked unusually tense. The older investors noticed him immediately. So did Victoria. A quiet ripple of uncertainty began spreading through the room. Nothing obvious. Just enough to shift the atmosphere. Jason sensed it too. For the first time all evening, he glanced toward the entrance instead of toward the crowd. His smile faltered for half a second, then returned. Victoria's phone vibrated once more. 2 minutes left. She stared at the message. Around her, the music continued. The champagne continued flowing. The celebration continued moving forward exactly as planned. Yet somewhere beyond the mansion, something far more important was already on its way. 2 minutes left. Victoria Bennett stared at the glowing words on her screen before locking her phone and slipping it back into her purse. The countdown felt unreal now. Too precise. Too deliberate. Around her, the ballroom remained wrapped in luxury and celebration, but the atmosphere had changed in ways most guests could not yet explain. Conversations still filled the room. Glasses still clinked. Music still drifted softly from the string quartet near the staircase. Yet beneath the surface, something was shifting. Victoria could feel it. Across the ballroom, Jason Whitmore stepped down from the platform and moved through a crowd of admirers. He shook hands, accepted congratulations, and smiled for photographs. Every movement projected confidence. Every word reinforced the image he had spent years creating. Successful, charismatic, untouchable. The image seemed flawless. But tonight, for the first time, Victoria saw cracks in it. Small ones, barely visible, yet growing. An investor approached Jason with a forced smile. Jason greeted him warmly, but the man seemed distracted. His eyes drifted toward the ballroom entrance twice during a conversation that lasted less than 30 seconds. Another executive checked his watch. Then another. Victoria noticed because she had stopped paying attention to Jason's speech and started paying attention to everyone else's reactions. People sensed something. They simply did not know what. Near the front doors, the unfamiliar security personnel remained in position. One spoke quietly into an earpiece. The other glanced outside through the glass entrance. Neither looked like private security hired for a party. They looked like men waiting for an arrival. Victoria's heart beat faster. She told herself to stay calm. 1 minute and 40 seconds. Somewhere beyond the estate grounds, a chain of events was moving steadily toward them. Jason accepted another glass of champagne from a server and raised it toward a group of investors. "Tonight is only the beginning," he announced confidently. The group applauded, but the applause sounded weaker now, less enthusiastic. Attention was drifting away from him, and Jason was beginning to notice. His smile remained in place, yet his eyes moved more frequently toward the entrance. Victoria knew that look. It was the look he wore whenever something unexpected threatened his control of a situation. Her phone vibrated again. 1 minute left. She looked down at the message and felt an unfamiliar sensation wash over her. Relief. Not because she knew exactly what was coming, because she finally knew she would not face whatever came next alone. A sudden gust of wind rattled the tall windows along the western side of the ballroom. Several guests turned instinctively. Curtains shifted. Crystal decorations hanging from the chandeliers swayed almost imperceptibly. One woman laughed nervously and commented about an approaching storm. Nobody responded. Then it happened. At first the sound was so faint that only a few people noticed. A low mechanical hum somewhere in the distance. Easy to mistake for traffic. Easy to ignore. Yet within seconds it grew louder. Steadier. More distinct. Conversations began slowing. Heads turned toward the windows overlooking the lawn. Jason stopped speaking in the middle of a sentence. The room fell quieter. The sound continued growing. Not thunder. Not a storm. Something else. Something moving closer. Victoria slowly lifted her eyes toward the dark glass overlooking the estate grounds. The older investors exchanged sudden looks of recognition. One man actually lowered his champagne glass without realizing it. Across the ballroom, Jason frowned. For the first time all evening, genuine uncertainty crossed his face. Outside, beyond the illuminated gardens and perfectly manicured lawn, a distant light appeared against the night sky. And as every eye in the ballroom began shifting toward the same point on the horizon, Victoria Bennett felt herself smile for the first time that night. The distant light grew larger with every passing second. What had been a faint glow on the horizon now commanded the attention of nearly everyone inside the ballroom. Conversations dissolved completely. The string quartet stopped playing. Even the waiters carrying silver trays paused to look toward the towering windows that overlooked the estate grounds. The low mechanical sound that had begun as a distant hum now rolled across the property with unmistakable force. Jason Whitmore stood motionless near the center of the room. His champagne glass remained suspended halfway to his lips. For the first time that evening, nobody was looking at him. The realization seemed to unsettle him more than the noise itself. Victoria Bennett watched the shift happen in real time. Attention was moving away from the man who had spent years making himself the center of every room. The invisible spotlight was finding a new target. Outside, the beam of light swept across the lawn again. Trees swayed beneath powerful gusts of wind. Decorative lanterns hanging along the garden paths trembled softly. Several guests moved closer to the windows for a better view. Others began stepping toward the ballroom exits. Curiosity had taken over. Victoria felt another vibration from her phone. She looked down. One final message appeared. 0. Nothing else. No explanation. No signature. Just a single number. The countdown was over. A strange calm settled over her. Nearby, Richard Palmer suddenly went pale. The veteran investor stared through the glass with an expression Victoria had never seen before. It was not fear. It was recognition. "That cannot be possible," he whispered. Another executive standing beside him followed his gaze and immediately stiffened. "You recognize it?" she asked quietly. Richard did not answer right away. His eyes remained fixed outside. "I recognize the crest," he finally said. Those 4 words spread through the room faster than any speech Jason had given all night. A crest. The statement carried weight. Powerful families had crests. Powerful institutions had crests. People whispered among themselves, trying to catch a glimpse through the darkness beyond the estate lights. Jason forced a laugh. "Everyone relax. It is probably just someone arriving late." The joke died instantly. Nobody laughed. The silence that followed felt far louder than any applause. Victoria almost felt sorry for him. Almost. Then she remembered the comments. The public jokes. The months of neglect disguised as ambition. The way he had turned her loneliness into something she was expected to endure quietly. Sympathy disappeared. A sharp gust rattled the glass again. Several guests stepped outside onto the terrace. The mechanical sound intensified. Now there was no mistaking it. Whatever was approaching was moments away. Jason moved toward the windows, his confidence slowly giving way to confusion. He tried to maintain control of the situation, but uncertainty was beginning to show around the edges. The older investors noticed it immediately. They noticed everything. Beyond the estate, the light descended lower, larger, brighter. Then the shape finally emerged from the darkness. A sleek aircraft moving steadily toward the property. Guests collectively held their breath. Some reached for their phones. Others simply stared. The aircraft crossed above the tree line and illuminated the lawn below. Victoria's heart pounded. Not from anxiety, from certainty. The moment she had been waiting for had arrived. Around her, the ballroom that had once felt like a stage for humiliation was transforming into something else entirely. A place where truths would finally come into the open. As the aircraft began its slow descent toward the massive lawn beyond the mansion, Jason Whitmore's expression changed. For the first time all night, he looked genuinely worried. The aircraft settled onto the lawn with deliberate precision, its lights washing across the estate in sweeping arcs of white and gold. Guests crowded onto the terrace and along the massive windows, abandoning conversations, drinks, and business negotiations. For the first time all evening, nobody cared about Jason Whitmore's celebration. Every eye was fixed on the arrival unfolding beyond the mansion. The powerful hum of the engines gradually softened, but the silence that followed felt even heavier. Victoria Bennett stood near the edge of the ballroom, one hand resting gently against her pregnant belly. She had imagined this moment many times over the past few months. Yet now that it had arrived, she felt surprisingly calm. Across the terrace, Jason stared at the aircraft with growing confusion. The crest painted on its side clearly meant something to several people in attendance. Victoria noticed the reactions immediately. Richard Palmer was no longer merely curious. He looked stunned. Another executive whispered something to her colleague before both women exchanged alarmed glances. A third investor quietly set down his drink and straightened his jacket as if preparing for an important meeting. Jason saw those reactions too. That worried him more than the aircraft itself. The door remained closed for several long seconds. Anticipation spread through the crowd. Nobody seemed willing to speak above a whisper. Then the cabin door opened. A set of stairs extended slowly toward the grass below. Several black-suited security professionals stepped out first. Their movements were calm and disciplined. They formed two neat lines beside the aircraft without exchanging a single unnecessary word. The sight alone changed the atmosphere. This was not a celebrity arrival. This was something else entirely. Jason tried to laugh. Well, someone certainly enjoys making an entrance. His voice carried across the terrace. Nobody responded. Not one person. The absence of laughter hit harder than criticism. Victoria watched his confidence begin to crack. For years, he had measured his influence by the reactions he received from others. Tonight, those reactions belonged to someone else. The security team remained perfectly still. Then a figure appeared in the doorway of the aircraft. Older, tall, impeccably dressed. His silver hair reflected the estate lights as he descended the stairs with calm, measured steps. He did not rush. He did not wave. He did not acknowledge the crowd. Yet the effect of his presence was immediate. Richard Palmer inhaled sharply. "Good Lord," he whispered. Nearby, another investor actually took a step backward. Victoria heard fragments of conversations spreading through the guests. A name, then another mention of the same name. The realization moved through the crowd like a current. Jason looked from face to face, trying to understand what everyone else already seemed to know. The older man reached the bottom of the stairs and paused. His gaze moved across the lawn, across the guests, across the mansion, then finally stopped on Victoria. Everything changed. The reserved expression disappeared instantly. Concern replaced it. Warmth replaced it. The distance vanished from his eyes. Victoria felt emotion rise in her chest before she could stop it. The man began walking toward her. Not toward the investors. Not toward the executives. Not toward Jason. Toward her. Guests stepped aside automatically, creating a path across the lawn. Nobody needed instructions. Some forms of authority required no explanation. Jason's face drained of color. He looked at Victoria, then back at the approaching man, then back at Victoria again. For the first time that night, He seemed to realize that the story unfolding around him was not his story at all. And as the older man reached the edge of the terrace and Victoria took her first step forward to meet him, every person on the estate understood that the next few moments were about to change everything. The older man stopped only a few feet away from Victoria Bennet. For a brief moment, neither of them spoke. The noise of the crowd seemed to disappear. The mansion, the guests, the celebration, all of it faded into the background. His eyes moved from her face to the hand resting on her pregnant belly, and the concern in his expression deepened. "You should have called sooner," he said quietly. The words were simple, but Victoria felt the weight behind them immediately. She smiled through the emotion gathering in her eyes. "I kept hoping things would get better." The older man nodded slowly. "You always try to see the best in people." Then, without hesitation, he opened his arms. Victoria stepped forward and embraced him. The gesture lasted only a few seconds, yet it changed the atmosphere of the entire evening. Around them, guests exchanged stunned glances. Investors whispered to one another. Several executives looked as though they had just solved a puzzle that had confused them for years. Across the terrace, Jason Whitmore remained frozen. He stared at the scene unfolding before him, trying to process what everyone else was already beginning to understand. Richard Palmer finally broke the silence. "Charles Bennet," he said under his breath. The name spread through the crowd almost instantly. One executive repeated it, then another. The realization moved through the guests like a wave. Charles Bennet, the billionaire investor whose influence reached far beyond boardrooms and financial headlines. The man known for building companies, rescuing industries, and quietly shaping some of the largest business deals in the country. Yet despite his reputation, he rarely appeared in public. Most people only knew him through stories. Tonight he was standing on Jason Whitmore's lawn. Jason looked from Charles to Victoria and back again. His expression shifted from confusion to disbelief. "Victoria," he finally said. She turned toward him. For the first time all evening, he seemed unsure of every word he was about to speak. "You never told me." The statement hung awkwardly in the air. Victoria almost laughed. Not because it was funny, because it revealed how little he understood. "You never asked," she replied. Several guests lowered their eyes. The answer landed harder than anyone expected. Jason opened his mouth to respond, then stopped. No defense came. No explanation arrived. Charles Bennet watched quietly. He did not interrupt. He did not need to. The truth was handling the conversation for him. Nearby, an older investor shook his head slowly. "All these years," he muttered. "All these years and nobody knew." Another executive nodded. "That explains a lot." Jason heard the comments. His face tightened. Victoria could almost see the memories racing through his mind. Meetings that unexpectedly succeeded. Introductions that opened impossible doors. Opportunities that appeared at exactly the right moment. Things he had always considered proof of his own brilliance. Charles finally turned toward him. The crowd immediately fell silent again. Everyone expected a confrontation. Instead, Charles spoke calmly. "You built a successful company, Jason." The statement surprised everyone, including Jason. "Thank you," he replied cautiously. Charles nodded. "You worked hard for it." Another pause followed. "But success has a way of convincing people they achieved everything alone." The words settled heavily over the terrace. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Victoria looked at her father. His voice remained measured, but the disappointment beneath it was impossible to miss. Then he turned back toward his daughter. His expression softened instantly. "How are you feeling?" he asked. It was such a simple question. Yet Victoria realized it was the first time anyone had asked her that all evening. She smiled. "Better now." Charles offered a small nod. Around them, the guests continued watching in complete silence. Because everyone understood the same thing. The most important person at Jason Whitmore's celebration had never been standing on the stage. She had been standing alone beside the wall the entire time. The silence lingered long after Charles Bennet's final words. No one seemed eager to speak first. The investors who had spent the evening competing for Jason Whitmore's attention now looked far more interested in the man standing beside Victoria. It was a subtle shift, but in business, subtle shifts often changed everything. Jason felt it. Everyone did. The center of gravity had moved. Charles rested a reassuring hand on his daughter's shoulder. The gesture was simple, yet it carried more meaning than any speech delivered that night. Victoria felt stronger standing beside him. Not because of his wealth, Not because of his reputation. Because for the first time in a very long time, someone was looking at her and asking how she was doing instead of what she could do for someone else. Nearby, Richard Palmer slowly shook his head. "This explains more than you realize," he said quietly. Several executives turned toward him. Richard rarely spoke without purpose. 5 years ago, when Jason was trying to secure financing for his expansion into the Midwest, nobody thought the deal would happen. A few guests nodded. They remembered. The lenders suddenly changed their position. At the time, everyone assumed it was because of Jason's negotiation skills. Richard glanced toward Charles. "Now I am not so sure." More whispers spread through the crowd. Another executive stepped forward. "I remember the shipping contract with North Atlantic Logistics. That contract should have gone to one of the larger firms." "It should have," Richard agreed. "Yet somehow it ended up here." Jason shifted uncomfortably. "Are you suggesting I did not earn those opportunities?" His voice carried a defensive edge now. Charles met his gaze calmly. "No. Opportunity still requires effort. But effort alone is not always what opens a door." The answer seemed to unsettle Jason even more. Because it was not an accusation. It was a possibility. And possibilities were difficult to argue with. Victoria watched realization begin spreading through the faces around them. People were connecting dots. Small moments from the past. Unexpected introductions. Convenient meetings. Influential recommendations that had appeared without explanation. She remembered them too. The difference was that she knew where many of them came from. Years ago, she had quietly asked her father for nothing more than a conversation or an introduction. Never money. Never favors. Just opportunities for Jason to prove himself. Charles had respected her wishes. He had helped without taking credit. He had remained invisible because that was what Victoria wanted. "You protected him," one executive said softly while looking at Victoria. She did not answer immediately. The truth felt strange now that it was being spoken aloud. Finally she nodded. "I believed in him." The words echoed through the gathering. Several people lowered their eyes. Even Jason looked away for a moment. Charles remained silent. He understood that some lessons carried more weight when discovered rather than delivered. A cool breeze drifted across the terrace from the lawn. The aircraft lights continued glowing in the background, illuminating the estate with a quiet sense of inevitability. Jason looked toward Victoria again. "Why did you never tell me?" he asked. This time his voice sounded different. Less defensive, more confused. Victoria studied him for several seconds. "Because I wanted you to love me without my father's name standing beside me." The answer landed harder than anything else said that night. Nobody moved. Nobody interrupted. The truth had finally arrived, and it was impossible to ignore. Standing beneath the mansion lights, surrounded by guests who suddenly saw the evening through an entirely different lens, Jason Whitmore began to understand that the greatest thing he had ever been given was never a business opportunity. It had been the woman he spent years overlooking. The words lingered in the air long after Victoria Bennett spoke them. "Because I wanted you to love me without my father's name standing beside me." Nobody on the terrace seemed willing to break the silence that followed. The mansion lights glowed across polished stone and manicured gardens. The aircraft remained waiting on the lawn. Somewhere inside the ballroom, the forgotten music system continued playing softly for an audience that no longer existed. Jason Whitmore looked at Victoria as though he were seeing her clearly for the first time. Not as part of his life. Not as part of his image. As a person who had spent years standing beside him while asking for very little in return. "I did love you," he said quietly. Victoria lowered her eyes for a moment. "Maybe you did." The answer hurt because it was honest. She was not trying to punish him. She was simply no longer protecting him from the truth. Charles Bennett watched the exchange without interruption. His presence alone seemed to keep the evening grounded. No raised voices. No dramatic confrontation. Just reality arriving all at once. Nearby, several investors continued exchanging uneasy glances. The story they thought they were attending had become something entirely different. Earlier, they had gathered to celebrate a successful businessman. Now they were witnessing the consequences of a man who had mistaken admiration for loyalty. Richard Palmer folded his arms. "Do you know what surprises me most?" he asked. Nobody answered. "It is not that Victoria kept her family background private. It is that she stayed silent for so long." Several guests nodded. The observation felt impossible to argue with. Victoria smiled faintly. "I thought patience would fix things." Charles looked at her. Patience is valuable, he said. But eventually, it becomes permission. The statement settled heavily over the crowd. Jason heard it too. His shoulders seemed to sink slightly. For years he had convinced himself that Victoria would always be there. Always understanding. Always forgiving. The possibility that she might stop had never felt real until now. A cool breeze crossed the terrace. Victoria placed a hand gently against her stomach. The baby shifted again. The small movement brought her attention back to what truly mattered. Not the guests. Not the mansion. Not the embarrassment of the evening. The future. Charles noticed immediately. You need rest, he said. His voice softened. Victoria nodded. For the first time all night, the idea sounded appealing. Not because she was running away. Because she was finally exhausted from carrying burdens that never belonged to her. Jason took a slow step forward. Victoria, can we talk? The request sounded sincere. Perhaps more sincere than anything he had said in months. She looked at him carefully. Around them, every guest seemed to stop breathing. Waiting. Watching. Hoping to see what happened next. Victoria thought about the question. Then she smiled sadly. We are talking. The answer struck harder than any rejection. Because it exposed the real problem. They had stopped having honest conversations long ago. Everything since then had simply been noise. Jason looked away. For the first time that evening, he seemed unable to find the right words. Charles glanced toward the waiting aircraft. Then back toward his daughter. There is no rush, he said. Whatever you decide, you will not face it alone. Victoria felt emotion rise in her chest again. Not sadness. Relief. Pure relief. And as she stood beneath the mansion lights surrounded by people who finally understood her value, she realized something unexpected. The most important victory of the night was not that everyone now knew who her father was. It was that she had finally remembered who she was. Victoria Bennet stood quietly beneath the glow of the mansion lights and looked across the estate one final time. Just a few hours earlier, the evening had felt completely different. The laughter, the speeches, the endless celebrations surrounding Jason Whitmore. Back then she had felt invisible. Now every person present seemed to understand exactly who she was. Yet strangely, that was not what mattered most to her. The recognition from strangers meant very little. The recognition she had finally given herself meant everything. Around the terrace, conversations remained hushed. Nobody seemed eager to leave. The guests understood they were witnessing the final chapter of something important. Not a business story. Not a society story. A human story. Charles Bennet stood beside his daughter, patient as always. He had not arrived to control her decision. He had arrived to remind her that she had won. The distinction mattered. Jason Whitmore looked older than he had a few hours earlier. Not physically. Emotionally. The confidence that had carried him through countless meetings and celebrations had been replaced by something unfamiliar. Reflection. For years he had measured success through headlines, acquisitions, and public admiration. Tonight he was discovering a different measurement entirely. One that could not be displayed on a balance sheet. Victoria saw the realization in his eyes. For the first time in a long time, he was not thinking about what he had built. He was thinking about what he had neglected. The silence between them felt honest now. Honest in a way their conversations had not been for months. Jason finally spoke. I do not expect you to forgive me tonight. Victoria listened quietly. I know that. He nodded. But I should have seen what was happening. I should have seen what I was becoming. Several guests lowered their eyes. The admission carried more weight than any excuse could have. Victoria considered his words carefully. Then she smiled sadly. The problem was never that you changed, Jason. The problem was that every time you changed, I kept convincing myself you would change back. No one interrupted. Even the night seemed still. Somewhere beyond the terrace, the aircraft waited patiently on the lawn. Jason looked down for a moment. There was no argument left. Because deep down, he knew she was right. Charles glanced toward his daughter. Are you ready? He asked gently. Victoria placed a hand against her stomach and felt the small, reassuring movement beneath her palm. A future. A new beginning. A reminder that life continued moving forward no matter how difficult yesterday had been. She nodded. Yes. Together they began walking across the lawn. The guests instinctively stepped aside, creating a clear path toward the waiting aircraft. Nobody applauded. Nobody cheered. The moment did not need spectacle. Its power came from something quieter. Dignity. Halfway across the lawn, Victoria paused and looked back. Jason remained standing near the terrace. Alone. Not abandoned by the crowd. Not destroyed. Simply left with the consequences of choices he could no longer ignore. Their eyes met one final time. There was sadness there, regret, understanding, but there was also acceptance. Some lessons arrive too late to prevent loss. They arrive only in time to explain it. Victoria offered a small nod. Then she turned away and continued forward. Moments later, she climbed aboard the aircraft beside her father. The door closed. The engines slowly came to life. As the aircraft lifted into the night sky, the mansion grew smaller beneath them. Years later, many people would remember the evening as the night a powerful businessman lost the spotlight. They misunderstood the story completely. The spotlight was never what mattered. What mattered was the moment a woman stopped waiting for someone else to recognize her worth and finally recognized it herself. And in the end, that was the only victory she ever truly needed.